Okay, good morning. We're going to start our new unit, which is macromolecules. Any guesses as to what this word means? We've got molecules, and what do we think macro means? Some of you may know. Let's see. Macro means large, and so macromolecules are large molecules. These big molecules contain a lot of carbon atoms. Molecules that contain carbon atoms in biochemistry are called organic molecules. Why do you think big molecules contain a lot of carbon? That was a lot all at once. So remember, macro means large. So these are large molecules. All of the macromolecules contain a lot of carbon atoms. When things contain carbon atoms, they're considered organic for molecules. They're organic in agriculture is like grown without pesticides, but in biochemistry, it's any molecules that are containing carbon. And so truly all living things contain carbon. So all of the things that we tend to see in nature that are alive would be considered organic by biochemistry definition of organic. All right, now that we spent a little more time there, none of you have had chemistry yet, so I wouldn't expect you to know the answer to this, but you may have figured it out if you're super, super smart or know a little bit more about chemistry. But the reason macromolecules always contain carbon and a lot of carbon atoms is because carbon is really good for building large molecules. The reason it's really good for building large molecules is that it can make 4 bonds with other elements. Hydrogen is a small atom, and it can only make 1 bond with other elements. So every time a hydrogen bonds to something, like that's it. It's not bonding to anything else. So here you can see 2 carbon atoms bonded to each other, and then the hydrogen atoms that they're also bonded to. So they each carbon has 4 bonds, but each hydrogen can only have 1 bond. So if we tried to make something big out of hydrogen, it simply wouldn't work. But carbon is a really good element if you want to make large molecules. I like to stop here and get you guys to think about, or pause here and get you guys to think about what types of things you need to have in your diet for balance, right? Like if you're looking at a bunch of food on a plate and you say, how do you describe the things that are there? Hopefully, some of you will say, oh, in your diet, you should have protein. That's usually the one that students have the easiest time getting. But other things that you also need in your diet are carbs or carbohydrates and fats. And those are actually 3 of the 4 macromolecules. So we can divide macromolecules into 4 different categories. We're going to do carbohydrates first, then fats, proteins, and the last one, which we don't really think about for food because it's in all of our food and we have no trouble getting plenty of it, are nucleic acids. We've talked a little bit about nucleic acids in your quiz, actually, that you had today, molecular evidence. That term is talking about how DNA and RNA can give evidence of evolution. The NA in both of those stands for nucleic acids. So you probably haven't realized it, but we've been talking about a couple nucleic acid molecules already. All right, so this is to point out that carbon is special in how good it is for building large molecules. Oxygen can only make 2 bonds with something else, so you wouldn't be able to make a huge molecule with just oxygen. But all macromolecules contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, but they all must contain a lot of carbon. They don't contain as many oxygen atoms as carbon atoms. Let's move on. So to make these really large molecules, we're actually going to have these building blocks that repeat over and over and over again. So it's not like a fully unique structure. We'll have a small building block, and you can see here how it's like repeated. So that's how these macromolecules are made. They're not, random. It's a pattern. We'll look at each of the different patterns for the different 4 categories that we're going to talk about. Here are the 4 types of macromolecules, or 4 categories of macromolecules. Carbohydrates. The main function of carbohydrates is for short-term energy. And so I'm actually just going to leave it at the main functions for now. So the next is lipids, and its main function is long-term storage of energy. Nucleic acids, like we said, DNA and RNA, those are both molecules that store genetic information. Nucleic acids is a really simple macromolecule for us because it's pretty limited in their function, and there's only 2 types. So yay, a simple one. Proteins, on the other hand, are really, there's tons of types of proteins. Build muscle and many functions. Proteins build muscles, antibodies for the immune system, enzymes, and basically everything else that your body needs to do besides these things. So we'll start with carbohydrates. And next lesson, we're going to focus on the other. We'll do other ones. I think we only do lipids, but maybe we do lipids and nucleic acids. I don't remember. But so for this lesson, we're zooming in on carbohydrates. They're commonly called carbs. Sometimes people call them sugars, and that's sometimes accurate, but doesn't actually. It's actually sugar is a specific type of carb. So the main function is short-term energy storage. They have a couple other functions, but mostly that's what they do. The monomers of carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. Mono means one, and saccharide means sugar. So this is a 1 sugar molecule. Okay, so that's why sometimes people call them sugars. But sugars are only a good term if you're talking about carbohydrates that are like 1 or 2 monosaccharides in length. So if we go back to this image here, just 1 or 2 building blocks. So very small in terms of how large macromolecule can be. 1 or 2 sugars, we describe those as sugars. And like glucose is what we'd say is a simple sugar, or just a 1 or 2 monosaccharides in length. But cellulose and glycogen and starch are all really, really what we'd call a polysaccharide. They have many. Poly means many. So they have lots of those, hundreds of those building blocks connected together. There's sort of 3 types of monosaccharides. So you can think of this if these are Legos, right? And this is like your simple block, right? That these would be like different colors. Okay, so you have some different options. There are the 3 different types. So a glucose, fructose, and galactose molecule. Mono means 1, saccharide means sugar. There's the 3 different flavors of monosaccharides. You don't have to memorize this, but I just wanted to point out that they do come in sort of different options. And so if you bond like a glucose and a fructose together, that is different than if you bond a galactose and a glucose. A glucose and a galactose make lactose, which you're familiar with milk, right? Lactose is what's in the molecule that's in milk. And glucose and fructose, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, is table sugar. Oh, here's the, I should have waited. When there's 2 sugars together, di means 2, so 2 sugar molecules. You don't have to memorize these, but just so that you have some understanding of what these things are. So glucose bonded with a fructose makes sucrose, which is table sugar. Yay, I was right. Galactose plus glucose makes lactose, the sugar in milk, and then maltose, glucose, and glucose bonded together. So hopefully when you see these words now, you'll have some understanding of what they are. These are simple sugars, and this is kind of where sugar has its reputation for not being super healthy, simple sugars aren't that healthy for you because your body breaks them down very quickly. Whereas, like we talked about, cellulose, starch, and glycogen are really, really long carbohydrates. And so they take your body a lot of time to break down. And so those are healthier for our diets. Here are the polysaccharides, or many sugars. You have cellulose, 2 types of starches, and glycogen. Where we get those are listed up here. So starch and cellulose both come from eating plants. And glycogen is how animals store carbohydrates. And plants can store carbohydrates as either cellulose or starch. So then when you consume those things, like when we consume plants, we're getting these types of carbs from them versus since animals store it as glycogen, if we ate meat, we would be getting this type of carbohydrate. How many bonds they have, branches, whether it branches or not. And so this is telling us that it branches about every 20 monomers. And this one branches about every 10 monomers. You can see how this one's like, a little bit quicker to branch than this one. They might have a specific type of pattern to them or shape. You don't have to memorize those things, but just to point out that these are different molecules from each other, but they're all going to provide short-term storage of energy. So carbo loading, you may have heard of before. This is used by endurance athletes like marathon runners or triathletes, and it maximizes the storage of glycogen. So because we're animals, we will store carbohydrates as glycogen in our muscle and liver cells. And those are good places for us to store them. Well, in our muscle cells, we'll be able to use that energy really quickly. So the muscle can break down the energy it needs right there and turn glycogen into energy. The energy we're going to use is ATP. If you guys remember from Unit 3, cellular respiration, photosynthesis, heterotrophs turn sugars, glucose, into ATP. And that's what we're going to do here. We're storing sugars, carbs, as this particular really long carb, because that saves us room. And then we'll break it down into a glucose, and then we'll turn it into ATP so that we can do stuff. So carbohydrates burn first, and then the excess is stored. So a lot of times I get asked if carbohydrates are healthy. My response to that is carbohydrates are healthy. But, if it depends on the type of carbohydrate, we want those long carbs that get broken down over time. Short carbohydrates like glucose and sucrose, fructose, those things give you a quick burst of energy and then a crash because they go straight into your bloodstream. They don't get slowly broken down by your body. And that spike in glucose can increase your risk of diabetes. So longer carbohydrates are better. But carbohydrates themselves are important for you. If you consume too many, they get converted into fat and stored in your body. If you're trying to burn fat, you can try to lower your amount of carbs, but people tend to feel really hungry if they don't have enough carbs. So personally, I would not cut carbohydrates out completely because you want your diets to be sustainable and good for you and good for you mentally as well. When you need energy, your body's going to burn your carbohydrates first, and then it will burn fat, and finally protein. But burning protein is really bad. Protein, like I mentioned already, does tons of things for your body. Pretty much all of the other functions besides what the other three do is done by proteins. So you don't ever want to be limiting carbs and fats. Don't limit both of those. And we already talked about how athletes will do carbo loading before competing because it's easiest to burn carbs for your body to use right away. And so you can have peak performance. There's some other things that we'll talk about later that go along with carbs whether they're healthy or unhealthy. And I'll just add that in here, that carbs that have fiber with them or whole grain sources of carbohydrates are healthier for you than carbs that do not have any fiber, that have been refined or bleached. They remove some of the fiber, and it makes it, like white bread or most bagels. I say most because no one's ordering the multigrain bagel. So you could, theoretically get a whole grain, multigrain, fiber bagel, but nobody orders it. Nobody ever does that. You all get the, either plain or everything. Those are all bleached and refined, so they don't have fiber in them. And so that means that fiber helps your slow digestion of the carbs. So just like how longer carbohydrates are better for you than the short ones, if you're eating bread, having fiber in with it is really helpful for having a slow absorption. So having whole grain bread is going to avoid that energy crash that we talked about and lower your risk of diabetes. So fiber or whole grain, multigrain, whole wheat, those things are much better for you than the bleached white varieties that have been refined. And refined means removing the fiber. So that's it for today's lesson on macromolecules. We'll continue with this next class.